Hello viewers, welcome to my YouTube channel. Get ready for heart-touching stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's begin.
The morning everything changed. The coffee was still warm in my mug when the realtor called. "Margaret, it's done," Susan said, her voice bright with the kind of excitement that made my chest tight. "The Hendersons have signed. Congratulations, you're officially sold." I set the mug down on the kitchen counter, my hand trembling slightly. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the house I'd lived in for 43 years, illuminating the dust motes floating through the air like tiny ghosts. Outside, the oak tree I'd planted the day James came home from the hospital swayed gently in the breeze. "Thank you," I managed to say. That's wonderful." It was wonderful. It was supposed to be wonderful. I'd made the decision 6 months ago after my hip surgery, when climbing the stairs became a daily negotiation with pain. The house was too much, too many memories embedded in the walls, too many rooms I no longer used, too much silence on the days when the loneliness pressed in like a living thing. I decided to downsize, to move into one of those active senior communities with the amenities and the people and the built-in sense of belonging that I seem to have lost somewhere along the way. The Hendersons' offer had come in 3 days ago. It was a good offer. I'd accepted it immediately before I could change my mind. Now, as I stood in my kitchen, our kitchen, James's kitchen, where we'd raised 2 children and hosted countless holidays and argued about money and laughed until milk came out of our noses, I felt the weight of the decision settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat. The closing wasn't for another 6 weeks. I had time, except I didn't. The doorbell rang at 11:47 a.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. My son Michael had texted that morning saying he'd try to stop by sometime this week, but that was Michael speak for maybe Friday if I remember. I smoothed down my hair, which I hadn't bothered to properly style that morning, and made my way to the door. What I found on the other side was Michael, his wife Patricia, and their entire lives packed into a moving truck parked in my driveway. "Surprise," Patricia called out, throwing her arms around me before I could fully process what I was seeing. "We made it, we finally made it." Michael was grinning behind her, already pulling boxes from the truck. "Mom, I know we said we were still planning, but the lease came through early. We had to be out of the apartment yesterday, and Patricia's parents' place was a no-go because of her dad's back, so we thought, why not just come here? You've been saying we could stay as long as we need while we figure things out." I hadn't been saying that. Well, I had been saying that. That had been the plan back when the plan meant something different. Before Susan's call, before the Hendersons' signatures on the dotted line, Patricia pulled back from the hug, her face flushed with excitement. She was 8 months pregnant, her belly preceding her like a ship's prow. At 28, she had the kind of energy that made me tired just looking at her. They'd been married for 3 years, and in that time she'd become the daughter I'd never had, enthusiastic, warm, genuinely interested in my life in a way that made me feel less like a burden and more like an actual person. "We're going to fix the place up," she was saying, gesturing at the house behind me as if she could already see the renovations in her mind's eye. "Paint some of the rooms, maybe do that garden you always talked about doing. We figure we'll be here a year or so, save up for a down payment, and then we'll get our own place. It's perfect timing, really. The baby will have room to grow up in a house with a yard. Michael said you were always saying you didn't know what to do with all this space." I watched Michael pull a box labeled kitchen from the truck. His back was to me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the same tension that appeared whenever he was about to ask me for something he wasn't sure I'd give. "Michael," I said carefully, "can I talk to you for a second?" Tricia's face changed instantly. Some sixth sense, probably developed over years of her own family drama, told her that something was wrong. "I'm going to check on the truck," she said, touching Michael's arm. "Make sure the driver doesn't scratch the jamb on the door." Michael followed me into the kitchen, and I watched the light drain from his face as I told him about Susan's call that morning. "You sold the house," he said slowly, as if repeating the words might change their meaning. "I sold the house," I confirmed. "The closing is in 6 weeks. I thought you understood. I've been saying I needed to downsize. My hip." I know," Michael said, and his voice had taken on that frustrated tone that meant he'd been rehearsing this conversation in his head and hadn't liked how it went. "But Mom, we have nowhere to go. Patricia's due in November. We can't afford a hotel." "We can't," he stopped himself, but I could hear the rest of it hanging in the air. "You can't do this to us." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it with a depth that surprised me. "I'm so sorry, but I've already signed the contract. There are legal implications." "There are legal implications." Michael's voice rose. "Mom, there are legal implications for us too. We have a baby on the way. We're trying to build a life in your—" He stopped himself again, pressing his palms against his eyes. "Okay. Okay, we'll figure something out." Patricia's car was already in the driveway and the truck was still being unloaded, and reality was reasserting itself like a wave pushing back against the shore. The rest of the day dissolved into a kind of careful chaos. Patricia came back inside, and I could see her doing the mental math, trying to figure out how to recalibrate her entire vision of the next year. Michael tried to hide how betrayed he felt, but he wasn't very good at it. They unloaded maybe half the truck before the driver said he had another appointment, and by evening Michael and Patricia were sitting in my living room, their living room as far as they were concerned, surrounded by towers of boxes while I tried to figure out what I'd done. "I called my lawyer that night. Contract is binding," Margaret Chen told me, and I almost laughed at the irony of her name. However, there may be options. The most viable would be to contact the Hendersons directly and see if they'd be willing to negotiate a later closing date. If you can offer them some incentive, perhaps a reduced price or covering some of the closing costs, they might agree to a delayed closing of, say, 3 months instead of 6 weeks. What are the chances of that? I asked. Great, Margaret said gently. They've already signed off on a 6-week closing. Most buyers want to move in as quickly as possible. They have plans, mortgages, lives that depend on that timeline. After we hung up, I sat in the dark of my kitchen for a long time, listening to Michael and Patricia move around upstairs. Patricia's laugh drifted down through the ceiling. She was unpacking the nursery, I realized. The room that had been my craft room, where I'd spent countless hours doing needlepoint and pretending that staying busy was the same as staying happy. I called the Hendersons' realtor first thing the next morning. The answer was no. Susan delivered it with professional sympathy, but it was no nonetheless. The Hendersons were eager to close. They had already given notice at their current house. They had their own baby on the way. Of course they did. I offered to reduce the price by $15,000. Still no. Then I called a real estate lawyer, a different one because apparently legal problems required multiple lawyers, and asked if there was any way to break the contract. You could breach, he said, but the Hendersons could sue for specific performance or they could demand damages. It would be expensive and messy, and you'd almost certainly lose. So I was trapped. No, that wasn't right. They were trapped. Patricia and Michael waiting for a house that had just been sold out from under them, trying to move mountains because their mother had made a choice and then immediately regretted it, but was too proud or too scared to admit it. The weeks that followed were strange. Michael and Patricia settled in as if they had all the time in the world, even though we all knew they didn't. Patricia planted a garden with the enthusiasm of someone who believed in tomorrows. Michael repaired the fence in the backyard. They painted the nursery a soft yellow and hung up tiny animal drawings. They made the house into a home again, which was exactly what I'd wanted it to stop being, and I watched them do it while the weight of my choice pressed down on my chest like a stone. I spent hours on the phone with the realtor, with the lawyer, with Susan, looking for loopholes, for alternatives, for some way out of this that didn't involve admitting I'd made a terrible mistake. But there wasn't one. The contract was signed. The closing date was circled on calendars. The Hendersons were not budging. By the 7th week, I'd run out of ideas and time. I sat down in the kitchen one morning, the one that would soon belong to the Hendersons, and wrote a check. Then I called Margaret Chen. I'm going to break the contract, I said. What do I need to do? The conversation with the Hendersons' lawyer took place via email and took 4 days. In the end, I paid them $30,000 to walk away from the sale. It was money I'd been saving for my retirement community, for the independent life I'd envisioned for myself. It was money that represented my freedom, my independence, my refusal to be a burden to my children. I was paying it to stay. When I told Michael and Patricia, Patricia cried. Michael didn't say much, he just hugged me and I could feel him shaking. You didn't have to do that, he kept saying. Mom, you didn't have to do that. I know, I said. I wanted to. It wasn't entirely true. I'd had to do it. The moment they'd arrived at my door with that moving truck, I'd known what the right choice was. I just hadn't been ready to make it. The house is different now. It's fuller, louder, more alive than it's been in years. Patricia's belly has grown into a complete person, a daughter born on a snowy November night. They named her Margaret after me, and I cry every time I hear the name. I'm not moving. I'm not going to the senior community. I'm not downsizing or simplifying or preparing for my final act as a solitary player on a stage set for one. I'm staying in a house that's too big and learning to fill it with something other than regret. Michael asked me once if I regretted losing the $30,000. Ask me in 10 years, I told him, but I know what the answer will be. Some decisions are too expensive to regret. Some choices once made become the only choice you can live with. My son and daughter-in-law arrived ready to move in on the morning I'd already sold the house. I thought it was the worst timing in the world. It turned out to be the best. The oak tree in the front yard is now climbing with a baby's mobile hanging from the lowest branch. Sometimes when I watch my grandson, yes, I had a grandson too, arriving just before Margaret, run through the yard chasing his sister, I think about that morning and how close I came to missing all of this. There are no second chances in life. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get a first chance to make the right choice instead of just the easy one. I've learned that distinction too late for many things, but not for this, not for them, not for home.